Up until one night when a routine moment with our horse took an unexpected turn, the stable had always been my haven from loneliness. It made me reevaluate all I believed I understood about trust limits and my personal preferences. Admittedly, it started innocently. At least that's what I initially told myself about my spouse. I realize this seems odd. The house felt too quiet and deserted while he was away on another business trip. I went out to the barn, as I had so many times before, in search of solace. In my otherwise ordinary life, Zephyr, our magnificent chestnut gelding, had always been a source of calm and tranquility. However, something felt different that evening, a shift that I couldn't quite explain, and in the barn's silence, I crossed a line that I never thought I would, one that dissolved the lines between loyalty, trust, and who I believed I was. I had always had a normal, predictable, and comfortable relationship with my husband. In his corporate career, he put in long hours and was frequently on business trips while I stayed at home. Together, we had created a life that was full of routine activities, calm weekends, meals, and long evenings spent watching TV, but there was something lacking from the surface. I couldn't instantly identify it, but as time went on, it appeared like our distance from one another grew, so I turned to our horse. We had always had horses on our farm. The barn was kept up nicely, and the field extended out like a peaceful oasis. The property was secluded from the bustling city, providing us with a peaceful haven. Although my husband liked horses and I could tell they helped him relax, he never appeared to regard them as more than a pastime. To me, however, the animals represented a link to something more profound, a means of escaping the routine of my daily existence. In the absence of my spouse, I would frequently go to the barn, feed the horses, and spend time with them. It began like that. You can observe the unexpected relationship. It was on one of my husband's business travels that I first entered the barn by myself. The air was clean, and I could smell the earth and hay. A big, gorgeous horse called Zephyr was standing in the stall. In the afternoon sunlight that streamed through his shiny chestnut coat, he looked wonderful. His eyes were a deep, profound brown that appeared to be watching me. I had never really been close to him before because he was always my husband's horse, but I was curious when I felt an odd pull and an unexpected connection with him that day. I paused for a while. I stood by the stall door and watched him. He bent his head and smelled the air around me, his nostrils twitching. I approached him slowly and carefully, saying, "Hey there," in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something about him that made me want to talk to him as if he understood, and for reasons I couldn't describe, I felt right at ease with him. Zephyr was his name, and he seemed to see my vulnerability the way I saw him over the next few days. Every time my husband was away, I would go out to visit Zephyr, brushing his coat, cleaning his hooves, and occasionally just sitting next to him in the barn's quiet. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a sense of peace. I was with Zephyr, an emotional release that I had longed for in my own life. As the days went by, my husband's trips grew longer, and I found myself becoming more and more connected to him. It was as if he understood my unsaid feelings, and when I rode him, I felt as though I was escaping into a world where nothing else mattered. The rhythmic motion of his gallop became my solace, and the sound of his hoofs beneath me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. However, one day, something changed. When I returned to untack him, I felt compelled to remain, even though it was initially simply a calm moment in the stable where I had spent the afternoon riding. Even though I didn't want to, I couldn't leave him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but as I ran my hands over Zephyr's sleek coat, I felt a wave of warmth that went beyond the basic connection to explain the weird need I felt. After a few weeks of building, I instinctively drew nearer to him. In fact, he appeared to lean into my contact, reacting to my touch in a manner I hadn't anticipated, and my hands lingered longer than normal. It started off with a gentle prod, a change in location, but I sensed the energy between us, a silent comprehension, at which point I realized how odd and unthinkable it must seem to someone who hasn't been there. But I could feel Zephyr's presence in every fiber of my body. It was as though he had become an extension of me, his thoughts and mine combining in some way that I couldn't explain. At first, there was an unmistakable tension and charge in the air, but it wasn't about passion. I tried to push it down and ignore it whenever we were together, but it was always there. My spouse had left. The thought of Zephyr drew me back to the barn. The nights spent at home by myself got colder. Even when my husband was home, the gap between us appeared to grow. I would wait for him to come home while sitting outdoors in the silence and listening to the wind. He didn't understand my wants or my silences, but Zephyr did, and I was unable to communicate with him the way I could. After a particularly long day, I found myself back in the barn one evening without saying a word. Unable to resist the attraction, I had attempted to ignore it and divert my attention. The pain in my chest, however, became intolerable. I found Zephyr waiting for me. Without hesitation or second thoughts, I walked directly to him. The barn was in the dark. Zephyr was there, the only light coming from the moonlight filtered through the wall fissures. He stood calmly as if he had been waiting for me the entire time, and I could not understand why I was doing this. Steady eyes on me. I remained there for a bit, trying to slow my heartbeat by inhaling the night air, and then it happened. As I extended my hand to touch Zephyr's guy, something changed between us. The connection was no longer only emotional. I'm not sure what caused it. It was deeper, and I became acutely aware that I had gone too far. I took a step back, wondering why I had no desire to quit thumping in my chest. Just what had I done? However, I was determined to remain truthful. For some reason, I couldn't help but feel that Zephyr and I had something in common that was inexplicable, something that had been ingrained in me and that I couldn't ignore. The story didn't end there, though. It wasn't a passing moment. Rather, it was the start of something from which I couldn't escape, something that grew. As the days went by, I found myself going back to the place repeatedly while my husband was away on business trips. I wasn't sure what to call it, but I knew that I couldn't stay away. When I first crossed the line, I thought it was a mistake, something I would regret and bury deep inside, hoping no one would ever know. I tried to convince myself that I was just confused and that my loneliness had clouded my judgment, but that wasn't the problem. It was a need, a deep visceral need that grew with every visit to the bee barn. Zephyr was no longer just a horse. He had become my secret, my escape, and my obsession. His presence haunted me even when I wasn't with him. In the quiet moments of my day when I was by myself in the house, I would think of him. Of the way his coat gleamed in the sunlight, the way his muscles rippled beneath his skin when he moved. In the way he responded to me, I could practically feel his heat. Our connection was irresistible, drawing me in like a magnet. Despite my best efforts to avoid it, the quiet and the distance were what drew me in more than the actual proximity. Seemed to say more between us than words could. Zephyr had nothing further to say. He knew that he felt the need to make me feel wanted, noticed, and understood. Every touch and gaze we exchanged was enough to make me feel hot and bothered, and I was powerless to stop it. Despite my repeated attempts to convince myself that I was being silly, that I was simply lonely, and that I needed to get my act together, I kept going back to the barn. The fact was that I didn't want anybody else. It wasn't even that my husband was gone. Yes, he was often abroad on business, but I still had my own life to enjoy. I could have gone out with friends, concentrated on hobbies, or even taken up work again. I didn't want anybody around me. I didn't want to fill the hole with meaningless things. That night, when everything between us had altered, I wanted Zephyr. Although I was glad to see my husband after a week-long trip, there was something about him that made me feel hollow as he lay next to me in bed. His steady breathing seemed to only make the chaos in my head worse. I was unable to concentrate on the warmth of Zephyr's body or the rhythm of his movements. It all played back in my mind like a movie on repeat. I slid away. For a brief while, I felt conflicted as I got out of bed, being cautious not to disturb him, and stood by the window, gazing out at the barn in the distance. The moonlight softly illuminated the field. After returning from the barn for hours, my body still tingled, and my skin continued to hum, a combination of the life I had created with my husband and the bizarre new world I had started to create with Zephyr. The connection between us pulsed with a beat of its own, and Zephyr's presence seemed to linger in the air with the recollection of what had happened. It refused to go away even though I attempted to push it away. Now there was no turning back. Then I returned to the bed. I could hear my husband's soft breathing as I moved more slowly, as though in a trance. The stillness between us seemed oppressive as he turned his back on me, utterly oblivious to the tempest that was building inside of me. I had always believed in our love, but suddenly it felt distant, and the emotional gap I had been trying to ignore was getting harder to ignore. My husband was a nice man, and he didn't deserve this, but just then, I couldn't care less. I was left alone again the following day as I awaited the chance my husband had scheduled to meet with a colleague. With only the noises of the home and the fields outside as companions, I was unsure of what it was that drew me in. Maybe it was the way Zephyr's eyes pierced me whenever I was in close proximity to him. Perhaps it was simply the allure of a long-suppressed need, but I didn't hesitate to act. When I realized my spouse was gone, I headed toward the barn. I made rapid progress. I didn't say anything because it seemed like something deep inside of me knew that if I slowed down, I might stop, and I couldn't stop right now. Zephyr was waiting for me as usual, his coat sleek, his muscles moving beneath his skin as he turned to face me, his eyes locked on mine, and I swear I could see the same longing in them that I felt in my chest. It seemed no longer essential to use words. I approached him, my pulse racing, my breath coming in short gasps, my hands shaking as I reached for him, and I felt a shock of electricity run through me when I touched his mane. The world outside the barn seemed to disappear as I focused solely on him. I didn't know what came over me, but I didn't want to fight it. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like every nerve in my body was alive, every fiber attuned to him. He nickered softly as if inviting me closer, and I didn't hesitate. My hands wandered over his coat, the warmth of his body seeping into my fingers, my skin prickling with sensation. I didn't want to stop. The only sounds in the barn were Zephyr's gentle breath and his man rustling beneath my fingertips, and I was unable to break the stillness. The tension between us became heavy and obvious. As I pressed myself against his side, I felt the heat emanating from his warmth seeping into me, making it impossible for me to break away. I was unwilling to. I felt a surge of heat as Zephyr shifted and turned his head to nuzzle my neck. His breath felt warm on my skin, and I gasped. I was astonished by the sensation and desired more. The world outside the barn seemed to stop for a moment as Zephyr leaned in, his nostrils flaring, and I swear I could feel his heartbeat echoing against mine. I reached up without thinking, grazing his face with my fingers, and then it happened. I have no idea what transpired next. I'm not sure where the distinction was made. I was no longer just standing there, though, as my body moved closer to his hands in ways I couldn't describe. The feel of his muscles beneath my touch made my breath catch in my throat, and I was unable to stop myself. I was completely engrossed in it, and every instinct in me cried out for more, for something I couldn't describe, because there was no turning back now. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, I understood what I had done. I could feel my breath heaving in my chest. I felt vulnerable, ragged in the barn's silence, the warmth of Zephyr's body seeming to permeate every inch of the room. With my body shaking and my heart thumping in my chest, I withdrew, feeling exposed. Despite the shock of what had just transpired, I was certain that there was no going back. The boundary I had crossed was not only a physical one, it was a line in my heart and mind that had been obliterated, and I had no idea how to locate it again. I was consumed by thoughts of what had transpired, how my body had reacted to Zephyr, and how his presence had overwhelmed my senses. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it engulfed me. I tried to push it down, telling myself that it was merely a brief period of insanity, but it wasn't. Instead, our connection had grown stronger. My spouse was no longer with me, leaving me alone with Zephyr and my thoughts once more. It was impossible for him to know that I wasn't home even while he was. Truly gone now. It felt like a part of me had woken up that I didn't even know existed, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop thinking about that barn, Zephyr's presence, his warmth, and the way he made me feel in ways I couldn't explain. All I could think about was the sensation of Zephyr's breath against my skin and the warmth of his body against mine. The days seemed to pass quickly, and I found myself missing him every time I wasn't with him. Even while my husband was around, I started going to the barn every day. I would justify it by telling him that I needed a walk, some fresh air, or simply some alone time. I told myself that I couldn't tell him the truth about what was going on inside of me, and that I needed Zephyr more than I needed him. We were now at odds. Zephyr was not in the stall where he usually stood waiting for me with his gentle eyes, so this time when I arrived at the barn, something felt different. Every time I entered that barn, I felt as though I was entering a world where only Zephyr and I existed, a world where the outside noise and my life's expectations vanished. In a quiet voice, I called his name. He usually answered my calls, but he was always urgent, but now there was stillness. A rush of terror rose through my chest. If he had suffered a misfortune. I opened the doors to every stall as I hurried through the barn in the hopes of finding him. At last, his low whine reverberated throughout the barn, and I followed the sound, and when he spotted me, his eyes brightened, and he galloped closer to me, his hooves producing a rhythmic sound. He was simply standing there, near the far end of the barn, his head bowed as if he were thinking deeply. As he approached me, he nuzzled me tenderly with his nose as if to reassure me that everything was well. For a little period, I stayed motionless on the hard floor, watching him approach. I extended my hand to stroke his mane. His warmth appeared to emanate from my hands, which were shaking from the intensity of the feelings coursing through me, and I closed my eyes before simply standing there and experiencing the moment. However, I wasn't just standing there. Something inside of me was changing once more, a silent need or desire that I couldn't ignore. I breathed shakily as I caressed his neck, feeling the muscle beneath my fingertips vibrating with each motion. The air was heavy with unsaid understanding, and I could feel the intimacy between us. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the distance between Zephyr and me was shrinking, as if we were merging in some way that transcended the physical realm. The emotional connection between us had become so strong that it was difficult to tell where I ended and Zephyr began. He seemed to react to every thought and feeling that went through my head, and I became sensitive to every movement and breath he took. It was as if we were speaking without words, a silent understanding that grew stronger by the second. I pressed myself against him, my hand trailing down his side, pressing my body against his. The warmth of his body seemed to dispel any remaining doubts or hesitations I had. There was only the two of us and the quiet bond that bound us together. There was no use in attempting to figure out why this was occurring. I had long since given up on it. I had an odd surge of feeling when Zephyr moved, pressing his chest softly against mine. His breath felt warm against my skin, and as I closed my eyes, I felt the sensation spread throughout my body. My hands brushed over his coat, and the smoothness of his muscles beneath the skin sent a wave of warmth through me. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up the tension between us, and I had never felt so alive. The emotional intensity and the sense that I had discovered something that went beyond the ordinary, that Zephyr was no longer only an animal to me, but my equal, were more significant than the physical proximity, though. I understood him in ways that no one else could, and he understood me in ways that I could never understand anyone else. His eyes met mine once again, and I sensed an electric current flowing between us, our bond becoming closer in a manner that was almost terrifying. I felt his warmth, vitality, and life force, and for a moment I felt as if I had merged with him. I was no longer simply me, I was we. My hands automatically reached for his man, drawing him nearer to me. His body reacted by pressing against mine with a light force that made my pulse beat. Every inch of him appeared to burn with a yearning that was just like mine. He was no longer only by my side, he was now a part of me, and I was a part of him. Something inside of me retreated as fast as the heat erupted, but I couldn't resist the draw any longer. The tension that had been steadily building between us over the previous several weeks had now reached a peak. As I stood there, my body shook, and my breath was short. I understood what I was doing. Guilt and shame hit me like a cold pail of water. What was I doing? What was I? I was unable to look at Zephyr for a time as I withdrew from him, my pulse racing in my chest. As I staggered back, my hands shaking as I wiped my face in an attempt to clear my head of the confusion, I was overcome with remorse and the dread that I had crossed an irreversible boundary. Zephyr didn't walk away, But in that quiet, he appeared to grasp that I had nothing to say and no explanation for what was going on between us. From me instead, observing me with those profound, perceptive eyes while I was unsure of how to calm the tempest roaring within me. I was unsure of how to break free from this weird, twisted bond that had developed between us, and I was uncertain of how to return to the previous state of affairs because, despite my best efforts to convince myself that I could, I knew deep down that I was someone else and not the person I had been before. The most terrifying aspect was that I was uncertain about my desire to return, as I had crossed a boundary that could never be undone. I was immersed in a world I couldn't understand, spinning out of control. The attraction between Zephyr and me was undeniable, yet it was accompanied by a darkness that I was unable to overcome. The worst thing was that every single part of me, my body, mind, and soul, was frantically trying to draw me back as if I had voluntarily entered a maze with no way out and no way to reverse what I had permitted to happen. Deeper into that maze, deeper into Zephyr's orbit, the guilt was sometimes overwhelming, but other times, when Zephyr was near me, the guilt subsided as he nuzzled my neck or brushed against me with his warm, soft body. It seemed insignificant compared to the magnetic pull that now existed between us. When Zephyr was close, I wasn't reminded of the life I had left behind, the vows I had taken, the promises I had made, and everything seemed to make sense in a way that the outside world could never. There was no noise, no judgment, just us. But the tension was becoming higher. In my bones, I sensed it. It was more than simply Zephyr and I becoming closer. It was the knowledge that I couldn't continue to live in this hidden world indefinitely. The facade I had built with my husband was becoming more and more brittle by the day. I had managed to maintain appearances for a while, lying to myself and to him when he returned from his trips, but I knew he had begun to notice something in my eyes, a shift that could no longer be concealed. There were days when I felt compelled to completely give up that false reality rather than continue acting as though nothing was wrong. I was unable to conceal the way that whenever I was close to Zephyr, my body appeared to hum with electricity, and I would lose myself in ideas unrelated to him. My husband had been silent for days, and then one evening he approached me with a serious face. He was looking at me out of the corner of his eye with an expression I couldn't place, and the questions lingered between us like a dense fog that suffocated everything. He leaned against the door frame and searched my eyes. "What is happening?" With a quiet voice and eerie calmness, he asked. I swallowed deeply, my stomach churning, struggling to find the right words. A part of me wanted to reveal to Zephyr the truth about the secret world I had built with him, but I couldn't force myself to shatter the illusion. My voice sounded much more distant as I answered, "I don't know what you mean," than I had planned, and I despised myself for my hands' minor trembling and my heart's racing. After a lengthy minute of studying me, he pushed away from the door frame. "I've been giving you space because I believed you needed it, but this isn't you," he said, his voice now lower and tinged with concern as he moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You have changed." I had no response. It was as though the part of me that had been his wife had vanished, lost in a world that no longer suited, and I was no longer linked to the life I had known or the woman I had previously been. "I have been all right." Eventually, he forced the words out, even if they seemed like falsehoods. He was a bit stressed, but he wasn't persuaded, so he studied me for a second before turning to leave the room without saying anything more. What followed was a deafening silence. He was downstairs, and I heard him. He was pacing the kitchen, and I could see he was attempting to solve it, putting the pieces of a jigsaw he couldn't finish together. I was ready to go. I longed to flee and hurry to the barn to be with Zephyr, where we could just be together in solitude and the warmth of his body, but I was unable to do so yet. As the days grew colder, I found myself withdrawing even more. The draw to Zephyr was overwhelming, so I stopped acting like I was resisting it. It was getting hard to work without him now, and then it occurred. I headed out to the barn in the late afternoon after my husband departed for a meeting. I was aware of what I was doing. I was aware of the repercussions, but there was no going back. As Zephyr usually did, he greeted me, and I stood there, unable to take my eyes off of his rich brown eyes. There seemed to be a glimmer of our connection. With my hands shaking, I approached him because I could feel his presence, energy, and calm strength all around me. When I reached out to touch his man, something was different this time. There was a knowing between us and a certain intensity in the air. As I ran my fingers through his mane, I felt the tension in my body release and the rush of desire wash over me. My mind was no longer able to process it. My heart frozen, and a wave of terror swept through me as I heard footsteps. The ideas were too disorganized, the emotions too fresh. I hastily withdrew. I looked around the barn, my breath coming in short spurts, but it wasn't my husband's voice that stopped me cold. Something else did. Zephyr's eyes were wide, his body rigid, yet our peaceful bond remained intact. Time seemed to have stopped the world from waiting and holding its breath, but suddenly I heard the sound. My blood raced cold as I heard my husband's distinct voice and the barn door creak open. He had arrived home early, and I had been emotionally and physically captured. Not a single moment could be undone. I stood still, not knowing what to do. His footsteps echoed in my head like a countdown as I heard him approach the barn, my pulse thumping in my chest. I could feel the truth bearing down on me and the repercussions of my actions finally coming up to me when my husband entered the barn. I could no longer pretend or hide behind falsehoods. I avoided looking at him. I couldn't. He was standing by the door. He was quiet for a while before I heard him talk. I realized something was amiss, he stated in his calm, quiet voice. Even though I didn't want to believe it, I now realized that as I turned to face him, I was betraying him in the worst manner conceivable. My heart was heavy with humiliation since I had given the guy I had once loved all I had to him. This was not what I wanted. The words were barely out of my mouth when I mumbled them, but they did come out. The anguish in his eyes told me everything. There was no simple solution to mend what had been damaged, and there was no way to undo what had transpired between Zephyr and me. He didn't bother to respond. There was no reversing the harm I had caused, and the story had reached its tragic, irrevocable conclusion. My world had changed, twisted, and broken in ways I couldn't understand, and as the silence between us grew, I realized that no matter what happened next, there would be no returning to the way things had been. Everything had changed.